William Costello, welcome to Next Generation.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
We're in Austin, Texas, and it's nice to be in the sun with you. You conducted some of the first research in the world on the psychological profile of incels. What does the new hit Netflix show Adolescence get right, and what does it get wrong?
So it's making a big splash right now. So one of the most important things that's happening is it's bringing a lot of attention to the topic, and their treatment of the incel topic and the misogyny and the violence that perhaps comes with that is a lot more sophisticated than a lot of other shows that have done it, and a lot more sophisticated than some of the documentaries. Some of the documentaries tend to almost lampoon incels and the topic, or just kind of sensationalize it a little bit. This took time to kind of artistically dig into the psychology of a young person who perhaps becomes captured by that ideology, and how it manifests in their misogyny towards others. One thing that really helped with that is they were just really powerful actors in the way they depicted this storyline. I heard this morning that the teenage actor, who's I think 13, or plays a 13-year-old in the show, it was his first time on a set. And it's his first role, which is impressive enough. But for anyone who's seen the show, episode 3 specifically, is really powerful from his point of view. It kind of depicts an interview with him and his prison psychiatrist, kind of trying to get an understanding of his mindset and what caused him to do the killing that he did. And it's just such a powerful scene, an episode where he oscillates between extreme rage, then kind of insecurity, cockiness, kind of very, very prototypical kind of antagonistic teen aggression when faced with authority. And to think that was that actor's first time on a set. It was the first episode that they filmed. So that's pretty incredible. I think he has a great career ahead of him. But yeah, the main thing is that it's shone a light on this topic, and the series shone a light on a lot of other themes that are important too. So it depicted the kind of the uncertainty that adults have about the incel topic. So teachers and parents were very bemused when the topic was explained to them, and kind of were in the dark about it, which is probably, I bet, relatable to a lot of teachers and a lot of parents. When we work with schools or when we give advice to different groups, they're all kind of confused. We give a presentation to the United Nations counterterrorism teams, behavioral insights teams, and again, that was kind of the what do we do about this issue? We're kind of in the dark. It's alien to us. So I think the series really showed that pretty well. The acting, superb, like I say. But there was some things that I did wish they got a little bit better, but perhaps we can go through more of the good first, yeah.
Well, what do you think were the standout factors? You alluded at the start to other documentaries lambasting incels, and that seems to be much more commonplace. There's this fear-mongering around incels, and it's usually a convenient catch-all phrase used by the media. And you see this with loads of different groups, right? They just get lumped together for the convenience of a news article. Why do you think Adolescence did it differently? Is it maybe reflective of where the culture is at, or is it just a personal preference by the writers, the director?
I think what the writers were careful to do is take on the perspective of trying to get inside the psychology of the young man who became captured by this ideology, and all the different reasons from his psychology that may have led to him to ultimately stabbing his female classmate. It highlights the kind of the pressure for a young man in the modern world to give the impression that they're sexually successful. So even though he was just 13, and the cop in the program said, "What 13-year-old isn't an incel?" But maybe in the modern world, exposed to the internet and this idea that one of the I thought it was a brave decision for the writers to suggest that one of the kind of triggers for him to actually kill the girl was that he was being bullied by her, and she was calling him an incel online, and that incel can function as an insult to just a 13-year-old boy, kind of speaks to this idea that maybe being exposed to the manosphere type content puts a pressure on a young boy to kind of give the impression that they're sexually successful or that they're going to be. In the interview with the main character and the psychiatrist, he even goes to the extent of making up lies about how sexually successful he's been in the past with other girls and how confident he is on that front. But at the same time, he displays insecurities about feeling ugly. He's kind of acknowledges that she seems like a pretty woman, with the implicit kind of suggestion that life is maybe easy for her because of that.
Well, I want to get into all of that in great depth. But first, what actually is an incel definitionally? Is there a minimum age limit on this? Because I think there's more nuance to it, but what the copper says about all 13-year-olds being incels, I think that there is some truth to that as well.
Yeah. So incel stands for involuntary celibate, but what we mean when we say incels is typically the online subculture. So the online subculture are a group of men who hang around in online forums and who form a strong sense of identity around their perceived inability to form sexual or romantic relationships. Often delves into very misogynistic rhetoric. There's a whole kind of ideology and belief system around this, which is mostly typified by the black pill, which describes what incels see as the particularly bleak truth to accept, that they believe they never stood a chance in the romantic realm and they were never going to find a partner, and primarily because they perceive themselves as ugly. They think that women prioritize looks above all else and that they never stood a chance. There's other elements to the wider manosphere, which is more kind of red pill and blue pill. So red pill describes waking up to see reality as it really is and women's true nature as they might depict it. And blue pill describes kind of the blissful ignorance of normies who are not familiar with how things really work. This is how incels might see it. So there's a lot going on there. Incels is just the really dark tip of the spear compared to the wider manosphere too. But yeah, you're right. Most 13-year-old boys, when your sexuality is developing, you do find yourself more involuntarily celibate than you might like. But it's just about whether this takes hold and becomes an identity, and you wrap the ideological beliefs and the misogyny all around it. That's where it becomes a problem.
So could you have a 7-year-old incel? It seems like there's no line if there's no sort of minimum age limit. Is it based on the fact that you have the intention of having sex but can't? What is it? Where's the line?
So it depends on whether you characterize it by just your circumstance. You do find yourself in the circumstance of being involuntary celibate, and that might apply to a lot more men than just the online subculture. But for me, it's impossible to prove that someone can't form a sexual or romantic relationship.
Sure.
So then for me, the important part becomes the identity element. Do you identify with this part of your circumstance? And then on a higher level than that, do you buy into the online subculture, the belief system, the rhetoric, the misogyny, and sometimes the violence? So there's kind of levels to it. But in the case of the young boy, yes, it's perfectly understandable for a 13-year-old developing his sexuality to not to find themselves as an incel. But I think what the show was trying to depict was that young boys now find themselves with an extra pressure to have sexual success earlier, or to show that they're the type of person that's going to. The fact that incel can still function as an insult to a 13-year-old kind of speaks to that modern pressure. And I think that's what that scene or that episode was trying to capture. The psychiatrist, on the one hand, you could say she was somewhat trying to pathologize typical developing male sexuality and insecurities around that.
Yeah.
And maybe trying to paint the picture that he had his brain pornified by pornography and all of this. But I think what it was really trying to get at is that this online world of the manosphere has put that pressure on young men, that it's more important than ever that they prove their masculinity, so to speak. And I think the suggestion was that he was trying to prove his masculinity by showing he was sexually successful, the type of man who would be desired, or the type of man that wouldn't accept it if he was insulted in that way. So it is getting at I think one of the main parts of the modern problem that young boys maybe find themselves in.
I remember, to pull out my own personal anecdote, being 19, I remember being 13 actually, and a couple in my year group, a state school in the UK, they had had sex, and it was going round, it was doing the rounds. Of course it was, because the guy was bragging about it, right? And actually the girl, in all fairness. And I remember my initial reaction when I'd heard this, because I was in a relationship at the time as well, that had been going almost as long as them, but I wasn't doing that kind of stuff, was one of disgust. And it wasn't disgust because what they were doing was disgusting. It was disgust at the fact that they were doing something that I wasn't. It was that intense feeling of FOMO that you get, and a sort of FOMO that I haven't actually felt since I was around that age. It feels like, you know, I still worry that I'm missing out, not going out clubbing with people, especially here in Austin. I'm like, I need to go out with my friends, but it's not the same intensity as when I was that age. And I want to, with my bro cap on, bro science cap, think, you know, and ask you, you're the perfect person to ask, is there any evolutionary grounding for that? Is it that I was pornified and that psychiatrist was right? Is it something else going on? Is it a modern phenomenon? Or actually, have men always felt this intense FOMO and pressure to essentially get laid at a young age?
So yes and no. I think the modern pressure is a little bit more. So that kind of FOMO, fear of missing out, is very typical of how incels describe their experience. So incels describe an irretrievable missing out of key developmental sexual experiences. So they even say things like, even if I was to get a girlfriend now in my adult life, the fact that I missed out on that genuine, real desire that is there in adolescence is still kind of means I'm incel. So there's almost a sense of nothing is ever good enough for them on one front, but there is a key developmental period where this type of status is going to be very, very important to you. And that would have certainly been the case throughout ancestral history, particularly if you feel your peers are getting ahead of you in that way. Being sexually selected by a partner is a huge sign of status. It functions to elevate your status. There's a reason the term incel is levied as an insult, and the show kind of gets into that. It's seen as a form of bullying to call someone an incel. So I think there is a good reason to think about our ancestral environment where you would have been in small-scale societies. Your reputation among your peers was crucial. So if you got the reputation as being someone that wasn't desired by the women in your tribe or whatever, that would have been perhaps detrimental to your chances. So you would have really tried to emphasize that wasn't the case for you, and you would have really tried to change your mateless circumstance if you could. What's novel about the modern incel movement, it might be different for other areas of the manosphere, but the modern incel movement is more doomerism than that. So they, on the one hand, they have the internet to kind of galvanize together, which maybe isn't typical of that resentment ancestrally or even in recent history. I think young men who had that feeling for most of our history would have tried to rectify it and been very fixated on trying to get romantic success. Whereas now, in this dark corner of the internet, incels galvanize together and try and encourage each other to not even try. So that could be framed as a type of intrasexual competition to try and get other men in your sphere to stop trying. But the more I look at it, I mean, incels really do appear to buy into it. But one thing that's interesting is there may be like a function to the misogynistic rhetoric of getting guys to talk to each other in this way. And I thought the show kind of hinted at that. So they describe a situation where Jamie, is it the main character? Yeah. Where he tries to make a romantic move on the victim, Katie, when he describes her as when she was in a position of being weak, when her self-esteem was on the floor because other misogynistic boys had shared revenge pornography and kind of described her as flat-chested. So the function, as I see it or as I theorize, of misogyny could be collective or coordinated condemnation of men trying to collectively lower women's self-esteem so they stand a chance. And we see an analog of this within relationships. So low mate value men within relationships choose what's called a cost-inflicting mate retention strategy, where they literally try and lower their partner's self-esteem so that they are less inclined to leave them. And they say things specifically like, who else would have you except me? Look at you. And that really try and lower the self-esteem or the mate value of their partner so they're easier to retain. It's really dark kind of stuff. So the way I kind of characterize this collective group misogyny is like that strategy, except from outside the outside relationships. Now, the collective condemnation or coordinated condemnation of doing it as a group, there's a reason that incels and these misogynistic men primarily talk to each other. They hang out in forums that overwhelmingly consist of just men. And yes, they express the misogyny towards women eventually, or in some cases, but it only works if other men are doing it too. So if you're the only misogynist and you're trying to lower a woman's self-esteem, you are very easily dismissed as just one asshole, right? Whereas if you convince most boys in your social milieu to come to the same conclusion about Katie, that she's weak at this moment, she's flat-chested, whatever it might be, then you maybe stand a chance and you're not the asshole. So if you think about the character in Adolescence, what Jamie tried to do was capitalize on other peer members of his lowering her self-esteem. So I thought that was a very, very sophisticated kind of allusion from the show. Whether it was intentional or not, I don't know, but it kind of does speak to the way this misogyny operates and how the functional element to it. And particularly ancestrally, this would have been very important because it was small-scale society. There was only a certain amount of young men in your social milieu. If you convinced 9 out of the 10 of them to lower the woman's self-esteem, to all come to the conclusion that she's getting too big for her boots kind of thing, it may work. Whereas now in the modern world, there's so much positive reinforcement from a woman through Instagram likes, wherever it might be, that this strategy isn't really that effective. It's still easy to dismiss someone as just an incel. But it is very interesting that mostly these misogynistic men are talking to each other and trying to get them to come to the same conclusion. And if you think about the misogynistic rhetoric, it's so targeted towards mate value. If you think about functional design for a type of attack towards someone, that the goal was to get her to lower her standards, you'd say things like, oh, you're not as pretty as you... And you think incels do this all the time. They say women don't want their looks matched. They have way too high standards. They say things like, oh, you're going to hit the wall when you're over 30. Your mate value will run out. There's lots of sort of things. They even condemn their taste. So they say, oh, you choose the wrong type of man. You choose Chad for his looks, but he ends up hurting you. All of this is kind of designed... You should have lower standards, you should make a decision earlier and perhaps settle on me. So that's an interesting thing that the show somewhat touched on.
So these guys, they feel they can't provide value themselves to these women. So instead of adding benefits to her life and providing value, they inflict cost on her to avoid her from running off with these other potentially high status or higher status men that she's hanging out with.
Precisely. And that's exactly the way it works within relationships. Men who are high mate value choose the benefit provisioning strategy. Lower mate value men choose the cost infliction strategy. And we do see in the recent research, there's been a lot of research in the last number of years that show this trend that misogyny is most pronounced in low mate value men and men who are have unwanted celibacy. So not just incels, but men who don't define themselves as incel subculture, but find themselves with unwanted celibacy. That is a big predictor of misogyny too. So the show might have inadvertently or very sophisticated way got at something important, I think.
So following that logic, do you think that with the rise of all of these trends online of female empowerment and, body positivity, it seems that all of these traits that used to be called toxic masculinity, of being overly assertive and not giving a fuck about anyone else, are now signs of female empowerment? It seems to me that what you're suggesting is the more those circles grow trying to empower women, the more the criticism is going to grow too, of low status men feeling like they're having to contend with all these women online with loads of likes and affirmation.
Yes, and there is evidence to show that the more kind of free you make women's choice, and the more kind of economic power they get, that's where incels arise. There's a really cool study done that find you can predict geographic areas of more incel activity, more incel rhetoric, based on 3 variables. So number 1, income inequality, where there's a large gap between high status men and low status men. Number 2, low gender pay gaps, where women are not needing to depend on men in the same way, where women kind of are free to have higher standards. You see a lot more incel rhetoric there, where there are fewer men that women desire. And then the final variable is just male-biased sex ratios. So when there's fewer single women to go around in the first place. So even information in the local mating ecology, as kind of crude as that, can predict the rise of or the intensity of incel rhetoric. Because it is quite like that maybe perhaps in the modern mating market, women don't need to settle in ways that they might have in previous generations. Even in the show, it kind of hinted at it that his father, it went into the storyline of how he met his wife, the kid's mother, and it was just at school, and they got together kind of straightforward, and it was a clear path to how to form a romantic relationship. I think the modern mating market for young people is very atomized. The kind of the social institutions of how you might meet someone are kind of vanishing, and it's kind of being funneled towards just online. Which perhaps isn't doing anyone any favours. Both sexes seem to not like the online dating. But yeah, institutions like even meeting your partner at work is kind of frowned upon now. It's not the done thing. So all of this is kind of creating a kind of an atomization where young men and young women are more responsible for their own dating life, which is pretty evolutionarily novel. I mean, you had a lot of kin networks or even friends setting you up on dates in the past. That's kind of novel. Now you're responsible for it yourself. And it could lead to a lot of disgruntlement from both men and women in how to do that. So women will have the problem of there are fewer desirable men around because they're outpacing them in terms of education and employment. And men might feel resentment at, well, in past generations, it would have been a lot easier for us to find someone to settle down with us, but now they don't want to. So it's causing resentment for both groups.
There's so much to dig into there. And I want to stick just on the topic of status for a little bit. Something that gets reiterated a few times in the show is this Pareto's principle idea of 80% of women being attracted to 20% of men. And one of the actors, he's the cop's son. He goes on to say something that almost sounds scripted, like he's just reciting from an Andrew Tate video he's seen online or whatever. That's sort of what was implied, I think. He goes on and he says, women, you must trick them because you'll never get them in a normal way, following that Pareto's principle quote. How much truth is there to that 80-20 rule?
Well, I think there is some truth to that there is what we call attraction inequality in the mating market. So more men are attracted to more women than women are attracted to men, all things being equal. Now, something as crude and as hard and fast like an 80-20 rule is a little bit kind of a blunt analysis. But like you say, that Pareto distribution applies to almost anything. The kind of the very narrow top end of the success spectrum gets a lot of the success. And it perhaps in the past, there were these social institutions. So, for example, monogamy is one. We have a deep ancestral history of polygyny, where one high-status man would have multiple wives.
83% of history, right?
83% of human societies had preferential polygyny. Now, that doesn't mean that there was a lot of polygyny in those societies, but it just meant that that most high-status man would have multiple wives. Most men in those societies would still only have one wife, but the fact that some men at the very top do have more than one does mean there are others kind of left out. Now, there's a really good paper by Joseph Henrich called The Puzzle of Monogamous Marriage, and it shows about how culturally cultures that began to practice monogamy flourished in a way that those that didn't kind of went by the wayside, because basically they solved the problem of a more egalitarian distribution of mates. They basically removed the problematic incels from causing a lot of trouble, because if you have a a growing number of young men who are without a marriage partner, they cause a lot of trouble in those societies. And throughout history, cultures have invented cultural institutions to try and deal with this excess population of single young men. In evolutionary psychology, we call it the young male syndrome. When young mateless men are around the place, they elevate their risk-taking and status striving very high, because if you're on track to get a evolutionary zero, you kind of will take a lot of risks in trying to change that. So monogamy kind of buffers against that. So it evolved as a cultural norm, and cultures were more peaceful. Now the pressures for women to settle down with one man are kind of gone away to some extent. I was saying that cultures throughout history have invented institutions to deal with these troublesome incels. So they would have made Vikings out of them, for example. They would have sent them on raids to get away from their own society. They would have sent them to the monastery, which was a somewhat high status position, which meant it was okay that you didn't have a marriage partner or a mate. Lots of different cultural institutions that recognized this problem and tried to deal with it. Modern men may have their own institution in the form of the internet that may be occupying otherwise really destabilizing young men. They may be just spending their time playing status games on the internet or in video games or with pornography. Kind of it's pacifying them or distracting them from going out into the real world and competing aggressively for mates that way.
But it doesn't seem to be satisfying them compared to the profundity of becoming a monk.
Mm-hmm.
So where does it go from here?
Yeah, that's the one element that there's no real status afforded to. Yes, you may get your sexual needs satisfied somewhat by pornography. That may be just enough to keep you satisfied there. You get your kind of dopamine satisfied by the status games on the internet, but there is no real world status, and particularly no status that comes from being sexually selected by a member of the opposite sex. That really elevates your status. So it is kind of dystopian, and you might see a world in future where a lot of men have the kind of the virtual artificial intimacy of virtual reality, sex robots in the future perhaps, but that's the one kind of element that it won't come with. It won't come with any status. Perhaps I'm wrong. Maybe in a dystopian future, the high status man will be the guy who can afford the most sophisticated sex robot, but I think there will still be special status to being sexually selected by the member of the opposite sex.
I think so too, and people always bring this up. AI girlfriends, they're going to change the culture, everything's going to be completely different, but there is that lack of real life selection, and it's something that gets put into thought experiments all the time, and it's a very philosophical question of, would you rather take a reality where or a made-up reality where you have more status, you have everything you want, you have sort of this infinite pleasure machine, and people seem to always be hesitant because there's just something, I don't know what it is, but about knowing that it's your real life that you're living, experiencing. It's not a simulation.
Yeah.
But I guess to play devil's advocate with that, you could maybe make the argument that humans, both men and women, they're emotional creatures. They're not necessarily as smart as these AI models, and certainly there'll come a time where they're not as smart in, just overall. Maybe there will be more status in getting an AI girlfriend because the AI girlfriend is super logical and she can, she's got the mental capacity, and this is just me thinking again with the bro science cap on, she's got the mental capacity, the storage to have an exact ranking of the status of all men in the world logged in her head. So if she chooses you, it's objectively true that you were of a high enough status. She wasn't horny, she wasn't whatever.
Yeah.
So maybe there does become more status in that than a human.
Perhaps that for me is the only missing link, but perhaps equally as likely is that they'll just become so compelling regardless that people will care less about the status and they'll just live their life in the virtual worlds. Pornography is a two-dimensional screen, you're watching sex on it, yet a lot of young men are addicted to pornography or spend their time on there. Imagine a really sophisticated AI that knows your psychology really well, can convince you of things. There's even research now that shows that ChatGPT can convince conspiracy theorists out of their beliefs. So the fact that it can already convince people out of some beliefs suggests that the power is there to convince people into some beliefs as well, if that was the goal. So perhaps it will become, so compelling and so addictive to young men that they will eventually care less about the status or just have status from different things.
Well, what do you think is going to happen if you are forced to make a prediction here? Because the way incentives work, to me, it's obvious that this is all going to come down the road before we know it.
Yeah, so the kind of dystopian view is that you will have this stratified type of mating market where perhaps only the elite, it will become an elite status symbol to have an organic partner and compete in the real world, while others will just kind of plug themselves into the hedonic treadmill of, the AI virtual girlfriend. One white pill kind of scenario that I've talked about before is that perhaps men, given that there is still status afforded to men who are sexually selected by real women, perhaps they will use AI as a training ground. So if you think about the mating market at the moment, and the Adolescence show kind of speaks to this, there's no training for it. You just become a teenager and you're thrown into it, baptism of fire, and you have to overcome the anxiety, overcome the rejection. You have to figure it out by trial and error. Yes, there's lots of initiatives in school about sex education and consent and things like that. But as far as I know, there's nothing that's like a training ground of here's how you become desirable. Here's how you do it. It's all in the wild. And then that vacuum is filled by the likes of Andrew Tate, who is giving the kids a very crude answer on how to do this. And it's no mystery why they like what Andrew Tate is selling. If he's promising he can get you rich, how to get women, short-term sex, that's pretty appealing to a sexually developing young teenage boy. So given that there's no training manual, no training ground for this, but such an appetite for young men in particular, because they're the ones who compete for sexual selection more aggressively. Women compete for men too, but not to the same intensity. Young men are obviously crying out for a training manual on this. Pickup artist forums, they want to analyze this stuff and come to some sort of conclusion. So perhaps there will be an appetite for young men to use AI to actually learn beyond just the crude analysis of pickup artists, what will actually help you cultivate, romantic acumen and then cultivate positive relationships. That's a really white pill kind of version. Now you might say, well, young men don't use pornography to learn how to be better lovers, but there's no incentive in the same way. Using AI in the future to learn how to get sexually selected and how to cultivate a positive relationship, there's real value in that. So perhaps we should try and maybe, intentionally engineer that, like champion that this could be a use of it, rather than leaving a vacuum, which Andrew Tate will be happy to fill.
What fascinates me with the whole pickup artist forums and books like The Game is this conversation of where the line is between tactics and manipulation. A lot of people criticized The Game and said that it was manipulative, when actually a lot of the things spoken about in that book are just facts of life and the world. And I don't know where that line is. And I can imagine that maybe if people do have that practice on AI girlfriends, there comes a point where they've practiced so much that it's almost not authentic. And it takes away from, not to get too spiritual, but like what love actually is. Is there actually a point where you practice more and it might be more optimal? You're thinking about everything really cerebrally, but actually there's a hard line that just goes too far and it's no longer love, it's no longer human.
Yes, and if you're a woman dealing with this, I remember when The Game and all that started, there was like a brief window where women were not familiar with it, but very quickly they became familiar with, pickup artist tactics, and it kind of didn't work. So is what you're saying maybe partially that it kind of removes the natural filter of female sexual selection in the first place. If you're using AI to train what would otherwise be lower mate value men who wouldn't figure it out.
It's like, I can't remember that book, but it told everyone to always speak, "Hi, William," use their name.
Yes.
It's one of the best-selling books. I can't remember what it is.
How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Exactly.
Dale Carnegie, yeah.
But now everyone knows that everyone's read that book, right?
Yes.
So whenever you hear someone just insisting on using your name every sentence. You know that they're trying to do something, maybe not nefarious, but it feels that way because they're not living in the moment. It's not truly authentic. And I think that's the key word, is what is authentic.
Yes.
And that's impacted by loads of different things.
Yes, and status hierarchies inevitably form anyway, however much you raise the bottom line. But this idea of young men developing themselves or wanting to learn to try and gamify, or, if the dark way to put it would be manipulate women into relationships with them, it's kind of intuitive for young men to develop themselves with the goal of getting a girl. But this is sometimes framed as misogynistic to even do, but it needn't be. It becomes misogynistic when the only people doing it are pickup artists who really emphasize, from what's clear to me from looking at it, is they emphasize a short-term mating victory. And what's an interesting kind of developmental arc of a lot of these pickup artists is that they all follow a very similar trajectory. So Neil Strauss, who wrote The Game, he had this coming of realization that it was unfulfilling. They get to the mountaintop of pickup artistry, realize it's not very fulfilling, and then want to figure out a different game, which is how to cultivate positive long-term relationships. Dan Bilzerian, similar kind of trajectory, gets to the top of the mountain of pickup artistry, realizes it's not fulfilling, and develops something else.
On Twitter instead.
Right. Well, yes, maybe he's not the best example, but this idea of coming to the realization. So I think in terms of interventions with young men in schools, that would be one thing to really champion, is showing them that, yes, if you even if you succeed with the pickup artist strategy, it won't lead to fulfillment. It leads to kind of unsatisfying victories. But this idea of developing yourself to try and get sexually selected is very intuitive to young men, and it needn't be framed as misogynistic at all. In fact, I worked a lot in schools up and down the UK, and motivating young men to get into class and learn. If somebody would actually tell them, well, unless you get the status that comes with higher education and a good job and, intellectual ability, that's actually one route to getting a lot of romantic success. No one really mentions that to them. So at the moment, nobody is teaching young men how to become romantically successful except pickup artists, and we're trying to firefight the damage that's doing instead of getting ahead of things and saying, well, can we offer something different instead?
I don't want to get lost in the weeds too much, but what's it like having studied all of this and knowing all of this evolutionary psychology that goes on and all of these patterns? Do you ever find yourself implementing that into your life and you're doing these romantic things, I don't know, for your partner, not because it's a personal feeling of love towards her, but just because you know that particular motion will yield that result? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, well, you can't switch it off. If the feeling of love hits you no matter what. So I'll give an example of something like sexual jealousy. You can understand the evolutionary function of that, and it's to protect your paternal certainty of your mate. Once you encounter something that makes you jealous, it hits you like a truck. It's like Mike Tyson says, everyone has a plan until they're punched in the face.
Yeah.
Our evolved psychology is kind of like that. You're strapped with it, whether you can be a world-leading expert on it, and it can still, you're stuck with that same psychology. It does help you implement some things and understand certain things in different ways, but it's hard to overcome it. And it certainly doesn't reduce the feelings of romantic intensity I feel for my partner, for example. That's all still feels real and magic to me, even though I might know where it comes from ancestrally.
What do you think the show says about this ineptitude of adults and institutions? Let's dig into that a little bit more. It's something that I see a lot. Kids are now in a position where they're teaching adults how certain things work, and that comes with a loss of authority for these adults that are meant to at least pretend to be know-it-alls. You think your parents know everything when you're growing up and you rely on them, and that's almost for the best. That's completely flipped now, and kids are the ones with the power because they've grown up with this technology, with social media, and they're the ones being asked the questions.
Yeah, so one thing I thought the show did really well was it didn't, and it was intentional, they didn't try and blame the parents. And there were no real clear-cut signs that he was going down this path. He just used to spend a lot of time in his room, rejected a lot of hobbies, and spent a lot of time on the computer. And the parents were kind of in the dark about what he was accessing. And that maybe is the scary thought for a lot of parents and teachers, that they just don't know what's going on behind closed doors. The show also depicted how kind of inept or ineffective the school system perhaps is. You saw a lack of good positive male role models of the male teacher coming in late, tucking in his shirt and not setting a good example. Other male adults and teachers being very aggressive and angry, which perhaps carries on as a role modeling as well. But yeah, it is a very an unusual type of adolescence that young people find themselves in now. And that kind of, specifically around romantic relationships, you can see that in the kind of the dichotomy between how his father met his mother at school, formed a romantic relationship, and it was straightforward. They had a happy life together, had kids. Whereas for this young boy, it's all a minefield. There's online worlds. He's getting influenced in these ways. They're basically learning about on dating from the darkest corners of the internet. So that's pretty unsettling for a lot of parents, I feel. One thing I think that the show maybe didn't get exactly right was the exact profile of what an incel might look like. So from our research, a couple of the trends that really come out strongly in the research is a high level of autism. So for all intents and purposes, the incel in the program Adolescence, he seemed a fairly popular kid. He had friends. Yeah. He was socially adept. He was good in school. Whereas in actual fact, we find that incels, there's a massive overrepresentation of autism in the incel community. So for example, using the AQ10 scale, which is a scale to test whether someone meets the criteria for a referral for autism, using that scale, roughly 30% of the incels in our sample would qualify to get a diagnosis for autism from an expert clinician. Now, that's extraordinarily high if you think that it's just 1% of the male population in America that qualifies for an autism diagnosis. So that's a huge overrepresentation. And you can imagine a young man who perhaps has autism trying to learn about the mating market. They want black and white solutions. So you can imagine that the world of pickup artistry might really appeal to them. They'll try and learn, and then they'll try and implement the crude black and white tactics that they learn about. If they don't work, they'll come to the black and white conclusion that they're incel. And there's a lot about incel ideology that really makes young men with autism very vulnerable to it. So it would have been interesting for the show to explore that. But
with that, just to flip that, could it be that because incels have been exposed to these forums where they're all very much wallowing in their own failure or perceived failure a lot of the time, could it be actually that a lot of them are just seeking an autism diagnosis as an excuse?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a massive kind of trend. I think online incels would be particularly prone to do that, yes, because they have what's called a tendency for interpersonal victimhood. And the online world kind of to some extent champions a victimhood identity. So perhaps they are saying that. They do look for excuses. But incels online mainly try to blame it on their looks. They do say that autism plays some part, but a lot of them blame it mainly on their looks. But all we have to go on is the research that we have. The autism thing is spoken about a lot by incels in their forums. Roughly 18% self-report diagnosis. But by our research using the scale, which is it's one of the only scales that's used to decide whether someone meets the criteria for an autism consultation with a clinician, 30% of our sample would meet that criteria. So it's kind of, it's just a set of 10 questions. It's not just saying whether you have autism or not. So,
what else does the show get right or wrong about the demographics of incels?
So, particularly in the UK and the US, we find massive overrepresentations of people of color in the incelosphere. So, in our recent research, which is the largest incel study in the world, 42% of that sample was an incel of color. So that's something that perhaps it
That's
didn't
the
get
next woke phraseology to be thrown around. I'm an incel of color.
Incel of color. And it's interesting because incel, it's not very easy to get sympathy for them when you speak about them to other academics and things like that. But one thing that manages to cultivate some sympathetic hearing from perhaps more woke ideologues is highlighting that there's a disproportionate number of young men of color who identify as incels. And they actually even blame their struggles on the racial component. They say that women are racist in the dating market, and they blame their struggles on their racial identity. So that's another thing that I think the show isn't exactly right on the research. The mental health issue. So one of the huge findings we have from our research is the extremely poor mental health among incels. And that didn't really come through with the main character in Adolescence. Yes, it did kind of highlight some insecurities he had. It highlighted some kind of lack of self-esteem where he saw himself as ugly, but the character also displayed very high levels of cockiness and aggression. I don't think most incels would typically be like that. They have extraordinarily high levels of depression, loneliness, and suicidality. So when we talk about extremism from incels, often the extremism looks more like suicidal ideation. So to put that into perspective, in terms of suicidality, roughly 20% of incels in our sample said that they thought they had suicidal thoughts every day over the last 2 weeks. Now, to put that into context, among the general population in the UK, 5% of people have a suicidal thought in the year. So this is an extraordinarily high magnitude of suicidal ideation. Again, you have to maybe take it with a bit of pinch of salt that perhaps they're being performative. A lot of incel rhetoric online is very performative in terms of its aggression, in terms of its self-loathing. But it does stand to reason that this group, they tick all the boxes for young men that would be suicidal. Highly likely to be neat, so not engaged in employment, education or training.
What are the percentages on that?
So we found in our recent sample, 18% of the sample were identified as neat, compared to 9% in the non-incel sample. So pretty high. They tend to be lower income, tend to be living with their parents into adulthood, perceiving themselves as lower mate value. They tick all the boxes for what would be a risk factor for suicide among young men.
And something that's not mentioned in the show, because it's about a 13-year-old, is political leaning. And I find the percentages on that fascinating. So 38.85% of incels are right-leaning, 44.7% are left-leaning, and 17.47% are centrist. So very different to this far-right MAGA incel that the media often portrays.
Yes, it's not straightforward. And my ultimate conclusion from having done some research, it is a complicated picture. So yes, when my first piece of research came out, that was their self-identification of how they perceived themselves politically. And I kind of thought, this can't be right. I mean, anti-feminism, anti-misogyny is such a far-right kind of part of that ideology. There must be more of that going on. So in the next piece of research we did, we actually measured their political beliefs using it's called the Pew Ideological Consistency Scale, and that asks people a set of political questions. And again, the incels came out on average center-left in terms of their political views. Now, what is important to caveat is that among the incels we researched, the ones that were most likely to endorse violence and had aggressive tendencies were the far-right ones. So what you might find is that, yes, some of the most aggressive incels are far-right. The group, on average, come out as center-left. I just don't see them as that political altogether. One of the only political kind of views that they collectively agree on is perhaps anti-feminism, which is perhaps the main one that's picked up on by the media, and why they're characterized as far right.
Right. Well, they're this group that have banded together not because of a shared vision of the world, but because of a shared experience of the world.
Yes, they're not very agentic. There's no collective end goals. There's not even wide agreement on the exact causes of their predicament or what to do about it. So in terms of extremism or terrorism group, that's one of the main components, is an ideological group that has a political end goal in mind and agreed upon political action, often violent political action to take on behalf of the group. There's nothing like that for incels. There might be some rhetoric on what to do politically, but they're not very cohesive. They don't even meet each other offline. So in terms of even just the logistics of organization from a terrorist group, they're not very likely to have a group attack, but they are a big risk factor for individual lone wolf attacks of someone who kind of has a break, gives up on their own life, so wants to go down, take some people out with him. The kind of the school shooter profile, that is more typical of incels. But this idea that they're a collective group with organized end goals in mind is really, really far from the truth. The way I'd kind of depict it is, have you seen the new Batman film?
No, I haven't.
So basically the storyline is, spoiler alert for anyone, the Riddler, the villain, basically mobilizes an online army of incels. And again, from that logistics point of view, I just don't see it as very likely. These group of young men who are not very agentic, don't have much going for them, live with their parents into adulthood. I don't see them as, being able to mobilize them that easily together. It seems not very likely to me. The unrealistic storyline.
One of the things that Jamie says to this psychiatrist in episode 3, which is sort of the core of the whole series, you really get to know what's going on inside his head. He speaks about having killed this girl and that she was there and he could have done anything to her after killing her, but he didn't.
Yes.
And that seems to almost equate to him being a nice guy, to use the internet terminology. How do you think that maps onto other incels and the general vibe given by incels? Because there's a lot of conversation about this, and there's this classic idea that, the comedian that goes up on stage and speaks about how women are so strong and important goes back home and beats his wife. He's the nice guy. How much truth is there to that nice guy caricature, and is there something, again, evolutionarily feeding into this?
I think, again, in that scene, it was very much Jamie trying to almost salvage some semblance of good character to try and show. And, it shows how confused his mind was that he's even framing this as, what do you want? Praise for not doing anything to the girl you just killed? That's kind of a window into his mind. But yeah, it does kind of mirror that incel rhetoric of, we're nice guys, but women don't want that. They want Chad, who is handsome, but treats them like garbage. And, there's some element of truth to this in that women are much more likely to be harmed by abusive partners that they choose or that they end up in relationships with than sexless incels. But incels, perhaps, they try to suggest that the mating market is organized in such a way that it's based around looks primarily, so that they basically have an excuse to not develop any other qualities. There's a lot of reasons to think that a really depressed, really anxious, perhaps highly autistic young man who doesn't have a job, who's not in education, lives with their parents into adulthood, there's a lot of metrics before we even think about looks that this person wouldn't make for a great partner at the moment. Perhaps they could if they developed themselves, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they're not altogether that nice type of guys. I don't think nice guys hang around in forums being misogynistic about women, but it does speak to the kind of the functionality of this misogyny, is trying to denigrate women's choices of choosing looks that they perceive in order to lower their standards so they stand a chance.
But I guess
perhaps they're bitter that being just a nice guy or just having a job or just doing the bare minimum throughout most of recent history perhaps would have got them a girlfriend, and now it doesn't. There is evidence that people are demanding more and more from their relationships, and if you're a modern woman, you're earning a lot of money yourself, you've got a pretty good state system for making sure you're of your safety. The role that a partner would have played of being there to provision you with resources or there to protect you, those roles aren't as salient. People don't need to be role mates as much as they used to. So they're now looking for soulmates and just people who fulfill you. And it means that there's a lot fewer men out there that kind of measure up on those criteria. So women, their solutions to this kind of conundrum is some of them will just remain single, which is a lot better prospect for them than it is for the men. Men are not happy to stay single in the way that women are, modern women are. Other women will perhaps mate down with perhaps a less eligible man who earns less than them or who is less educated than them. There is some evidence that that's happening. But in those status mismatch couples, you find a lot of other problems like intimate partner violence. You find high rates of depression, anxiety, erectile dysfunction from the men in those relationships, infidelity, a whole slew of problems. So it's not necessarily obvious to me that the fact that some women are beginning to mate down with what would be perceived as less eligible partners, that's not really strong evidence that their preference is shifting. I still think they're coming to this problem. And there's a lot of data points that I sent over to you that show that women are disgruntled about the lack of good men that are available. If you look at the reasons given for unwanted childlessness, or even the reasons given that women are choosing to freeze their eggs, a lot of the top reasons are could not find a partner who met my my criteria, who didn't measure up to my standards. So each group is kind of coming to a different kind of type of disgruntlement about modern mating.
Close to half, 45% of college-educated single women in the US say their relationship status is largely due to an inability to find someone who meets their expectations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you add on to that, how many would be willing to mate down in terms of educational levels, it's clear why. There's women are outpacing men in education, so there's fewer men, but they're still unwilling, or mostly unwilling, to mate down. It's kind of clear. It's the same reason given for the unwanted childlessness. It's the same reason given for the freezing the eggs. And it kind of, the overarching trend I see that's kind of causing this disgruntlement on the mating market is this increased autonomy. So if we take just women for a second, the absolutely revolutionary power of the hormonal contraceptive pill has freed women up to prioritize their career and succeed in education and employment at unprecedented rates that they never had before. So a lot of women are choosing and perhaps feel obligated to follow this path, to succeed in their career. And they pursue this status and don't think about starting a family until it's too late. Don't think about finding a partner. And also, the more they succeed in their own career, it renders more and more men ineligible in their eyes because they want the similarly educated partner. So they're squeezing themselves on time and the number of men who meet their standards. So they end up perhaps encountering unwanted childlessness, which is a huge problem. I mean, a lot of people hear me talk about this mating crisis and they think, oh, what? You want to strip away women's freedoms and make them have children, and fertility crisis. Women are free to do what they want. But I absolutely think women should be free and should be able to have the amount of children that they want. Not just what society needs, it's what they themselves want. And there is some data to show that if a woman hasn't had a child by the time she's 30, I think 50% of those women will not go on to have a child, despite 80% of them wanting to have a child. You find that women who say that they want children, those who are higher achieving in work and education, are precisely the ones that have higher goals for having children. So it's really causing a conflict that their goals, they're following what's called a slower life history strategy. So, the fact that they don't need to have kids so quick, they delay it and they prioritize status first, and they run into this problem where their window closes.
It's a common thread with a lot of the issues that I've discussed on the podcast before, and it's always a difficult topic to navigate because at the core of it, it's something good that's causing all of these issues.
Yes.
And what are we going to say? Go back to the kitchen, make a sandwich and be less liberated and you'll be happier.
Yeah.
That's not what you can do. And the data's just baffling on this. I'm so fascinated by Stephen J. Shaw's research with the depopulation bomb. And you see now that the total fertility rate, for example, in the UK is 1.44. You need 2 to even just be at replacement level. So all of the populations in the West, they're decreasing. Well, they're not decreasing now. That's a big thing. People always wonder, how can a population be about to decrease when it's growing at such a rapid rate? But it's about to take a nosedive. And you see things like in South Korea, the extinction rate within 2 generations is 96%, which is wild. I think there were some Korean magazines, they sold more dog strollers last year than baby strollers. And they sell more adult nappies in Japan than normal nappies.
Yes.
So these are all signs of what's happening.
Yeah, a huge problem, and it's a real bugbear of mine that it has become to worry about the fertility crisis or population collapse or the aging population has become what's perceived as a right-wing talking point when it's the most humanistic concern I can imagine. I think perhaps what's at the heart of that perception is that perhaps more left-wing people see the solution as A, it's good for the environment if there's fewer people, so that's one thing they say often, and B, they think that perhaps the problem can be solved with just opening the doors to immigration, which, you know, whatever your views on immigration, it doesn't work that smoothly if you do it really, really fast and in unprecedented numbers. And it's also kind of maybe perhaps a somewhat racist rhetoric that, you know, you could just move people around to solve your problems. It's like, oh, we don't have enough people here. Let's take them out of their homeland and get them doing the dirty work in our societies. But no, it's a huge problem. And before it becomes a population collapse problem, the aging population is the problem you'll hit. And perhaps what we might see in a dystopian future is a real championing of assisted suicide, of people being older people being pressured to kind of take the burden off the younger people in society by kind of having this assisted suicide thing. You see even in Japan there's some sort of cries to bring back this I can't remember what it's called, but it's like a noble decision to free yourself from being a burden on your kin. So if you have an aging population who don't have kin, they're a burden on people who are not related to them. I think that would be very, very stressful on a society.
How do you navigate that? How do you go about convincing people that currently think it's misogynistic to even mention these things?
So one solution I think of is that young women shouldn't be forced to choose between career and having a family. And, you know, we've made great progress in women succeeding in education and succeeding in the workplace. But one thing we haven't really solved is the motherhood penalty. So you had a video up about the gender pay gap actually last week, which actually is more accurate to describe as a motherhood penalty gap. Young women typically earn similar enough wages up until the age of about 29, and then the motherhood penalty hits. And it's hard to kind of think about how to solve that, because my mother describes it that young women, they can have it all, but not at the same time. And that's just true. One thing I think that could be brought up is perhaps just education initiatives for young women to learn about, you know, their fertility and the timeline they're on. I know it sounds like a simple thing that all women maybe know, but perhaps they don't. Perhaps they aren't thinking. They just, the biological clock doesn't tick until it's perhaps approaching too late. And perhaps that's something we could champion a bit more. The other thing is we could subsidize egg freezing. So I mentioned that a lot of young women, women who are choosing egg freezing, they tend to be the ones who are running out of time. They tend to be highly successful career women who are over the age of 30 and who haven't found a partner. But what about getting ahead of that? And egg freezing is very, very expensive. So it's kind of going to create inequality whereby the elites can afford it and working class women can't. But if you subsidized it and got most young women pursue the egg freezing when they're very young and can retrieve most eggs, and then they decide when they want how to use them. Either sell them if they want, it can use them themselves, but you get the most opportunity. And what's important is that carrying a pregnancy to term, the research is showing that it's not so much based on the age of the woman, but the age of the eggs and the amount of eggs that you have. So women could choose, if every young woman had that kind of system subsidized, every young woman has a longer window to decide on having children and has the optimal chance of doing so, whether or not they've found the right partner or not. They're not pressured into this kind of time squeeze that's running out. It gives them more time and it gives them more chance. So that's something that could be done. And I don't know how that would be perceived as from left-wing people on it, or what solutions they have. But that's one solution I think could solve the problem. It doesn't solve all of the mating crisis, but perhaps the unwanted childlessness that women have, it would move the needle on that one. And I think that's very important.
Well, there are two things for me. One of them is education and how long it actually takes. Is there a way to cut out the 2 years we have at college in the UK and actually go straight into university. So at least you get 2 more years before you hit 30 and have a 50% chance of going on to ever have a kid. So that's one thing, just sort of shifting your career and when it starts to a slightly earlier age. And there's nothing novel about this.
Mm-hmm.
We used to sweep chimneys when we were 8 years old.
Yeah.
So I wonder if there's something in forcing kids to take more responsibility at a young age. And this is very dangerous, obviously. And when you pressure people to make big decisions that they have no idea where to even start with, that can go wrong. But I do wonder if there's something in shifting the educational timeline forward slightly so that at the back of it, you have more years to get a job, get a stable income, find a partner before you hit that biological clock. But the bigger thing for me that I don't see all of the public intellectuals speaking about, maybe because they're just not on the ground to observe it, is speaking to people my age, other teenagers, other 20-year-olds. It's just a question of, is there actually any reason to bring a kid into this world and put them through the suffering of the world and the meaningless culture that we currently live in? That's the vibe, I'd say. That's the temperature of the water currently amongst my friends, is why would I bring someone into a world where they're not going to be happy?
Yeah, it's interesting. I wrote an article for Quillette about the birth strike movement, where I actually had watched them have a debate at the Battle of Ideas. And they're this movement that are basically going on strike and trying to encourage people to not have kids to save the environment. And it was quite jarring to see a father basically say to the audience, I love my 9-year-old son, but I wish I never had him, basically, which was really kind of jarring, and it's very anti-humanist and it's kind of giving up on the human project. Yes, there is a lot of rhetoric kind of driving towards your generation for people to have fewer and fewer kids, a lot of environmental concerns, but most people still want. There is worrying trends in the data that every year there's fewer young people who want kids, and actually I think more young men want kids than young women, which is maybe surprising to people, to our intuitions. But yeah, each year I think the data show that fewer and fewer women are saying they want to have kids. They prioritize career and status above that. You might have the statistics in front of you there on that one about how many women say that, or how many young people, men and women, say that they prioritize career success over getting married and having kids in terms of what makes for a full, flourishing life. But yeah, so that's one thing is, but whatever, I'm a kind of a utilitarian or libertarian in terms of people should be able to do what they want. But one thing we should definitely intervene on is the unwanted childlessness for women who want to have kids. So, whatever about convincing people to have more kids, try and solve that problem. We should definitely at least let people have the amount of kids that they want.
What do you think to this black pill culture within incels? Do you see that transferring more and more to outside the incel culture? Sort of the incels are almost imposing it on the rest of the world and it's working. Do you think that incels are black pill mainly because of everything that we've discussed? Or do you think actually it's representative of just the state of play with Gen Z becoming more cynical as a whole?
Yeah, it could be like a very extreme tip of the spear of a generational kind of vibe shift. But I think, I thought because Timothée Chalamet's Oscar speech or Grammy speech, that I thought ambition was back in now. Gen Z are flipping the table on that one, and it's cool to care about things anymore.
I think there are extremes. There's the end that are cynical and they rot in bed and there's no meaning to life. And then there's the other end that are like, they sacrifice everything just to have something to work towards, and they want to max out their life, so they end up just living a life of routine minute by minute.
Yeah, no, I would champion Timothy's movement of caring being cool again. That would be certainly something I'd like to see. But yeah, there is a Gen Z kind of doomerism that typifies your generation. But incel identity, so the black pill, when I first started researching this stuff, I thought, how could someone come to identify with such a component? Why would they choose this? But the more and more I looked, they actually gain a lot out of their incel identity. So they gain a victimhood identity, which is very, very popular in online movements now, very, very popular in the current moment. They get an excuse to not participate in a mating market that they see as humiliating, expensive, exhausting, anxiety-inducing. They get fraternity with their fellow incels. They get an online trolling language that's kind of fun to engage with. You know, there's a comedic element to a lot of their lingo, which kind of influences mainstream discourse. Like Black Pill is becoming kind of a mainstream thing.
Yeah.
They get a common enemy, which is very, very galvanizing for a group. So they get a lot out of it. So it is asking an incel to give all that up in favor of participating in a mating market that they don't fancy their chances in. It's actually a tall order. And you and me might talk and say, well, everyone knows that to become romantically successful, you have to go through a lot of rejection and you have to go through a lot of anxiety. But it's worth it on the other side. I promise you, when you get success, it's worth it. But who are we to say that to incels who maybe have a lot taller order, have a lot more challenges, who maybe are really a lot more unattractive, who are lower educated, lots of all these things. How much anxiety should they have to go through and us still say it's worth it? It's kind of understandable. I don't think it's right to give up on it, and I would try and convince incels I speak to keep trying, but you can understand how this incel identity would be seductive when compared to competing in the mating market. It's only understandable that you would choose competing in the mating market if you believed you stood a chance. If you come to the conclusion that you don't, and you get enough rejection and reinforcement that you don't stand a chance, and then there's this ready-made ideology that explains why you never stood a chance in the first place, very easy to buy into that. It's a lot harder to keep trying. Accepting the Black Pill is comforting to incels because it means they no longer have to develop themselves and try.
I can easily see as well how certain types of autism can lend themselves to all of that going on, and this lack of faith, because it takes a bit of faith to do anything.
Yeah.
And actually, a lot of the time, there's not a quantifiable reward waiting at the other end. That's the whole point of life.
Yes.
Otherwise, everything would be calculated. Whereas, you know, certain types of people, and I'd say I lean towards this direction in things I do. Like, I want there to be a quantifiable reward. I want to know the risk. I want to know the upside, the downside. And Jordan Peterson speaks about this, how a lot of people that are cynical, actually, the first step towards cynicism is being smart, because you see the risks of things, but you lack the faith.
Yeah.
So a lot of people that are cynical, and I see this again, I don't know if you had this growing up, but for me in school, there was always that smart kid who was really grumpy and cynical and depressed, and that was his character trait.
Yeah.
He was just down on everything, he was complaining, but like he was a bright kid, and the assessment he made of a lot of things would actually be spot on. It would just lack data.
Yes. Yeah, and it's a kind of a black box hidden future where the reward isn't clear and quantifiable to motivate incels with. And they're motivated to wake up in the morning and consume a lot of data very strategically that reinforces their doomerism worldview. And, you know, you wake up in the morning and you decide to consume information to reinforce any particular worldview, you can find it. And that's what incels do with the research. They find the most bleak examples of a piece of research or the most bleak examples of a woman's nature, and they take that as typical. One thing that would really maybe help with them is to cultivate real, genuine opposite-sex friendships and learn about the world through real life rather than from the Whatever podcast, who's kind of got a bunch of women on there to show the darkest side of female nature. And, you know, if you're learning about female nature from that type of a place, then you will come to the incel conclusion.
What do you think to this? This is something I wrote down on my notes briefly a while ago. The polygamy Molotov cocktail. Women are hypergamous. Men chase status. Status is achieved by your ability to market yourself, not your comprehension. Women attach themselves to vacuous celebrities a lot of the time. Mid-tier men sacrifice comprehension they had to unlock the women by favouring viralability. Is that a word? Viralability?
It is now. It's going viral.
On the internet. So you know, it's something I can imagine is happening a lot is that people are sacrificing doing the plumbing job, the electrician job that offers so much to society. And this is something I'm trying to mention more and more on the pod, is all of these jobs that the foundations of our civilization are built on, they're going out of fashion because people are favoring more marketable jobs that provide no value.
Yeah. So I used to be a careers advisor. So this is right up my street, actually. And something we found in recent years, that the number one career goal that young people had was influencer. And that, on the one hand, maybe makes sense. Is yes, influence is a currency that people want to have high status in order to influence people, but there was no real tangible why. To influence people to what end? To have influence, or what they would do to become that influencer. It was not like, oh, I want to become famous for being a top-level soccer player.
Yes.
It's now just straight to the chase.
Yes.
I want to be an influencer.
Half of young Brits want to enter the creator industry as influencers. 13% already think of themselves as influencers.
Yeah. So there's this new hierarchy that is the currency. They're kind of your Insta follower count or whatever it is marketable. But that's just one example of the human ability to create status hierarchies in a load of different ways. And that is perhaps cause for optimism, because this is some of the advice I give to incels, is create your own status hierarchy, create your own micro niche where you're on top. There was no hope that I would get a girl if I went to a nightclub in Miami. I just would not stand a chance, right? But if you put me in an intellectual conference, a debate festival or something, I might ask a really incisive question, get into a really interesting debate. That's my arena. So incels should really try and use that human ability to create multiple different status hierarchies and climb their own. But the career one, it's very interesting, because I think we're going to have a big redefining of status. So yes, men are being outpaced in education and employment. Will we see in 10 years maybe getting a PhD just won't be seen as high status? Men tend to typically assign status to things that they beat other men in rather than beating other women. So the fact that women are dominating in education, maybe it will just suddenly be no longer seen as high status. That is quite a sexist feature of society, actually, that female status hierarchies, men don't kind of perceive them as high status. So I would predict that will happen to some extent about education. It will result in what's called elite overproduction. And there's not enough, that's actually a really dangerous kind of cocktail for society, when you have elite overproduction and not enough positions to go around. So lots of PhDs, not a lot of assistant professorship jobs. That leads to a lot of disgruntlement. So that's kind of dangerous. But on the one hand, you might say that a PhD will become less high status, but maybe the few men that are able to get one as a man, maybe that'll still hold some high status for men, or it will very much depend on what you get the PhD in, that type of thing. It's gender studies, maybe not so high status, but physics or chemistry or engineering, probably still high status.
Yeah, when I think about it, it's a miracle that the degrees we haven't become part of Tinder profiles and Instagram bios, because then rather than 50% of people under 30 going to university, it would be like 80%. And I guess that collapse would happen even sooner. But I wonder if there's a way of designing some sort of new career strategy where the people that go through that course, whether it's an apprenticeship or some sort of other vocational technical education, they get some sort of bragging rights that they can put on their Tinder profiles, their Instagram bios, and then that would become the new measure of status. Whereas someone with a degree in English, they can't fucking put that in their Instagram bios because everyone else has it.
Yeah, but we recognize these different niche competence hierarchies all the time. So you know about the kid who was not great in school, not the smartest, but he was the best soccer player. And in that arena, he was the guy. And to all the girls that liked soccer, he was the guy to go for. So it's about playing your own niche and creating a status hierarchy there. It's hard in school because it's kind of this very one-dimensional status hierarchy. You get to find your own little worlds a little bit more as you proceed in life. You get a lot more autonomy out of the domains you hang around in. In school, you're kind of trapped in a building with everyone in your society, the best and the worst, and you kind of have to exist around them. You don't have much choice of who decides who's popular. It's very difficult. Whereas you get more autonomy as you grow older, and you kind of can carve out your own niches.
What do you think is the biggest thing you would want people to take out of the studies that you've done about incels? What big perception shift would you want people to have?
I would think the mental health findings we have are really, really jarring. So particularly the autism and the suicidality. So we think about extremism from incels, and they're often looked at with an extremism lens. And we worry about the potential for violence towards others, or the deep misogyny that is there for sure. And that's a huge opportunity cost of a generation of young men becoming so disgruntled with modern mating that they become incel, with all the misogyny that comes with that. That is a huge cost to society, in my opinion, men and women. But the mental health and the suicidality is something that, even despite our research and trying to bring it out into get attention on it, it still hasn't captured people to the full extent. Just the starkness of the figures. Incels, in my opinion, are far more likely to be dangerous to themselves than to others. But I guess people are characterizing the misogyny as a kind of a more a larger harm in and of itself. But in terms of violence, I think incels are more likely to be violent towards themselves.
Are you optimistic about the future for Gen Z?
For Gen Z on the whole, yeah. I'm going to champion individuals like yourself, go-getters, kind of optimistic people for the future. But it's a very unusual time coming. If you ask someone, if you describe any time window of 500 years apart into the past, 500 years, things weren't that different. Can anyone say that 500 years into the future is going to be anything recognizable to today? Very unlikely. It's going to be even just 50 years into the past seems like such a massive shift compared to any other 50-year window. 500 years would be huge. So, there's lots on the horizon that's hard to predict.
I was recently at ARC 2025, and Peter Thiel was one of the speakers, and he's notorious, whatever people may think of him, because he's controversial in a few different ways. He's been amazing at seeing opportunities early on and investing in these big companies that go on to change the world. And one of the things that I was super interested by was that he said in his address to everyone there that he sees AI as as big of an invention as the internet was, if not bigger. And he said that very casually, like he just glazed over it, which shows to me that he really does believe it. He didn't even make a big deal out of it, which is crazy. So, you see the internet, and a historian like Dan Jones speaks about that being way bigger than the Industrial Revolution even. And then you see someone like Peter Thiel speaking about AI and how that's going to be as big as the internet. Things are going to keep on changing, and I just prefer to take the optimistic route of thinking about how much has changed for the better and the resources we have. I mean, there's all this radicalization going on, and people can fall into the wrong echo chambers, but also you can fall into positive echo chambers. And I know that that's something that I've done. I grew up, my parents divorced when I was like 3. So I still have an amazing relationship with my dad, and I see him whenever we can, but like I wasn't growing up with a male role model in the house. So I relied a lot on YouTubers and people like Chris Williamson or Mike Thurston, all these different podcasters to teach me what a man should be. And I can see that, we've spoken about AI girlfriends and being able to train what's appropriate with them. I can see a similar thing happening where you've got almost not AI dads, but you've got people that can partially fill the dad-shaped hole that a lot of people currently have with so many divorces going on.
Big time. Really, really very important point. So it used to be that you became the average of your 5 closest friends, or the 5 people you spent most time with. Well, if you throw your content that you consume into the mix, and Chris is always talking about that you really need to be careful about the content, your content diet, basically, because you become like the content you're consuming. So training your algorithm, not just being a slave to the algorithm, whatever it throws you, is probably one of the really important skills we need to teach young people. But on the optimistic front, there's a lot of reason to feel more optimistic about the world. The news is full of negative stories because they're what's interesting to people. You couldn't fill the news and make people watch it if it was feel-good story after feel-good story, even though they exist.
Yeah.
So I'd encourage all your viewers actually to read Steven Pinker's newest book, Enlightenment Now. It's chock-a-block full of really optimistic findings about the human flourishing at the moment. And another thing I'd encourage your viewers to watch or to pay attention to is the website Our World in Data, and specifically infant mortality. The improvements that we have made around the globe in terms of how many women and their offspring survive childbirth is just incredible. It's a remarkable win for the human species. But yeah, the more I think about the human flourishing kind of project is Charles Darwin said that humans need to overcome the hostile forces of nature, and we're endowed with biological and psychological mechanisms that help us do just that. We're still trying to do that, and humans, each one of us, represent an unbroken chain of ancestors who overcame those problems for long enough to reproduce. Literally any chink in that chain, we wouldn't be here as individuals. So that gives me cause for optimism about what humans can do. Nearly went extinct lots of times and still here. So yeah, bring on more hostile forces of nature and we can figure out how to solve them.
William Costello, where can people find more of your work?
Well, just like a lot of intellectuals these days, I spend far too much time online on X. So at Costello William is where you can find me and follow my work, and anything we do, we post it there. So you'll hear about whatever we've got going on.
Beautiful stuff. Thanks for coming on, man.
Thanks for having me.